Thanks, Tani. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Kalkadoon people who are the traditional custodians of this land that I live and work on, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So, the Australian rural pharmacy workforce has been investigated extensively with respect to the underrepresentation of pharmacists choosing to work in rural and remote localities. Challenges associated with recruitment and retention have been studied in addition to factors that influence pharmacists to practice rurally. Since about 1998, the number of pharmacy schools in Australia has doubled, and more importantly, pharmacy schools in regional Australia have been established. The 2014 report on the Australian health workforce has indicated that 27,025 pharmacists were currently registered for practice in Australia. However, only about 1% were working in a remote or very remote location. A forecasted projection has been suggested of an expected oversupply of pharmacists of around 500 in the year 2025. Whether the expected oversupply will address workforce maldistribution, where only 20% of registered pharmacists are practicing outside of a major capital city, is yet to be determined. Although concerns have been raised about this potential national oversupply of pharmacists, those who are working in remote areas are still experiencing shortages. A 2013 study of the rural and remote pharmacist workforce identified that rural pharmacists had an average age of 55 years compared to the national average of 40 years. 55% of respondents and 45% of spouses were reported to have a rural background. The gender distribution was even. And the average length of stay in rural areas was about 15 and a half years, with locums representing more than 10% of the workforce and 13.7% of pharmacists reporting to be working more than 50 hours a week. It was also reported that pharmacists working rurally expressed the need for rural and regional pharmacy schools to ensure an ongoing rural pharmacist workforce. This has been reported as a strong factor in influencing students' intention to practice rurally. The differences in the professional roles of pharmacists working rurally were also examined, with hospital pharmacists reporting a very generalist role and community pharmacists describing having more regular and closer relationships with customers. Globally, graduates have indicated a preference for completing their internship training near where they studied, and which is an important consideration for regional pharmacy schools. There has been extensive research into influence, recruitment and retention for the rural pharmacy workforce over many years, from studies investigating personality and character traits to research into the costs associated with the high rural workforce turnover. An overwhelming majority of rural pharmacists surveyed in multiple studies have expressed professional satisfaction with their current role. Participants identified task variety, positive relationships with customers and health professionals, better business opportunities and economic incentives as being the main factors associated with their professional satisfaction. The low levels of reported dissatisfaction were generally attributed to professional isolation, overwhelming workloads and access to locums. Studies show that students need clear pathways to follow for integration into rural practice, and that rural and remote clinical placements are an enabler. In a study of pharmacy students' rural career intentions, it was identified that, once again, students from a rural background were more likely to work rurally after graduation. And although 93% of all students who participated in the survey considered rural placements as beneficial to their training, it appeared to make no difference to their career intention. Early career pharmacists are more likely to practice rurally if they have undertaken a rural internship, had a spouse or partner with a rural background and were not practicing in hospital pharmacy. Additionally, pharmacists from a rural background or those who had studied at a regional university were 4 times more likely to have taken a rural internship than those who studied at a metropolitan university. Although there have been a number of initiatives to increase the number of pharmacists working across rural and remote areas, a maldistribution still exists. Rural pharmacists have also suggested the following strategies to encourage recruitment: higher pay, accommodation provision and professional support such as professional development. This review will provide the first insight into and measure of the impact of a rural component in a university curriculum and exposure of students to rural placements on whether they choose to practice rurally in the future. This will also be valuable in informing both universities and the pharmacy practice as to how to increase the number of pharmacists going into rural practice, to address the maldistribution and provide better health outcomes for all Australians living in rural and remote locations. So Selina and Bev's research question was, what is known from the existing literature about the impact of university curriculum and rural clinical placements on students' intentions to practice rurally and rural pharmacists' choice of rural practice? ARCSI and O'Malley's six-stage methodological framework was used to structure their review. The methodology was chosen due to its strength in comprehensively assessing a broad topic and mapping the literature and identifying gaps in the literature. The concept of the studies included in the scoping review is the connection between a pharmacy curriculum, placements and the intention to practice, and the choice of rural practice location for current pharmacists. The article selection was undertaken according to Prisma. The search generated 294 records. After removing duplicates, applying inclusion and exclusion criteria, 53 articles were identified. 31 of these were then considered appropriate for the scoping review, and these were allocated to 2 domains based on study objectives, research design and outcomes mapped. So domain 1 was undergraduate pharmacy student rural placement. Domain 2, undergraduate pharmacy student rural curriculum. Results show that there are significant gaps in the literature to support the success of a rural component in the curriculum and placement programs provided through Australian universities to increase the number of pharmacy graduates choosing to practice in rural areas. All students undertaking a pharmacy degree in Australia are required to undertake placements. However, the length and location of these placements may vary between institutions. 25 articles broadly discuss rural placements, 7 included professional learning, interprofessional learning, 4 discussing community and cultural exposure, and 7 reporting on intention to practice in a rural area. Articles evaluating pharmacy students' rural placement programs illustrated that understanding pharmacy practice from a rural perspective, visits to rural health professionals and sites, and the attitudes of preceptors were essential for them to achieve satisfaction from their rural placement. Positive changes in attitudes towards rural practice, interprofessional experience, and Indigenous culture were also reported for students participating in non-traditional pharmacy placements. 72% of students in one study agreed that they would intend to seek employment in rural areas if opportunities arose as a result of increased rural awareness obtained from their placement experience. Some universities were only considering traditional placement sites such as community and hospital pharmacies, whereas others were actively pursuing non-traditional placement sites. In addition, although the Australian Pharmacy Council recommends rural experiential learning for undergraduate students, only 1/3 of the universities surveyed had compulsory rural placements. Across the 31 articles in the review, only 6 reported on any aspect of university curriculum, illustrating the limited literature available about the influence of rural practice education across pharmacy schools in Australia. The University of Sydney offered a Bachelor of Pharmacy Rural, which promoted great rural and remote content in its curriculum. The degree was specifically designed to help address a shortfall in the rural pharmacy workforce. However, in 2007, it published an article describing that their pharmacy faculty only had 0.2 full-time equivalent staff member dedicated to supporting rural initiatives, and that the government investment in rural health education was not translating into adequate resources to optimise rural health workforce outcomes. A study from the University of Sydney was conducted to determine change in students' intention to practice rurally in their first and final years of their degree. The study specifically considered the influence of rural background, being enrolled in a rural degree, and undertaking a rural placement. Results indicated that a rural background was a strong predictor, although 27% of students from a rural background were not considering rural practice after graduation. All 6 students who undertook the Bachelor of Pharmacy Rural participated in a 12-week rural placement and had expressed interest in future rural practice. The study also concluded that rural placement had a positive influence on intention to practice. Charles Sturt University was the first uni to offer a non-metropolitan pharmacy course. The university expected that students who had the opportunity to undertake an undergraduate pharmacy course in a rural environment would be more amenable to undertaking rural practice. The results from this study showed that 62% of all graduates in 2000 had accepted positions in a non-metropolitan location for their intern year. It's important to note that 60 to 70% of their students were originally from a rural area, and this may have a greater influence on intention to practice rurally than their university location or curriculum content. Rural clinical pharmacy placements and aspects of rural practice have been reported on in the literature. However, the impact of curriculum and placements has not been addressed to any great extent. This review appears to be the first providing some insight into the impact of rural placements and curriculum on the rural pharmacy workforce. Studies allocated to Domain 1 indicated that rural placements have had a positive influence on students' intention to work rurally. However, many of these articles have limitations. Additionally, most of them investigate intention to practice immediately after rural placement and do not follow through to actual practice location after graduation. Consequently, it cannot be determined that rural clinical placements are having any impact on increasing pharmacist recruitment or retention in rural and remote locations. In addition, articles have described the effect of rural and remote exposure on student placement. However, once again, these articles are predominantly narrative and represent single placement activities or programs. These unique programs are run in isolation at specific locations around rural areas of Australia, and thus impact is difficult to measure. In addition to rural placement, some undergraduate students are also introduced to rural pharmacy practice through a rural curriculum at their universities. Some universities describe their programs as having a major rural focus. However, evidence in the literature describing the quantity or extent of rural curriculum is very limited. None of these articles provide any information about what is actually being taught to their students. Anecdotally, students have requested more understanding of rural pharmacy, as the unknown is a contributor to their hesitance to consider rural practice. Throughout the review, there's no evidence of students' intention to practice rurally as a result of a rural curriculum. However, as discussed, there is some evidence of intention to practice rurally as a result of a positive placement experience. There is also an indication that rural curriculum had actually influenced students away from rural practice, and this highlights a need to further evaluate the quality and extent of the rural curriculum. A significant proportion of studies reviewed have either been written by academics employed by UDRHs or are in some way associated with the work of UDRHs. These studies all describe innovative placement activities and a positive impact on students' understanding of rural practice. However, there is no evidence to indicate that students participating in a placement with a UDRH are more likely to practice rurally. Results of this scoping review highlight significant gaps in the reported literature regarding the impact of undergraduate clinical placements and a rural curriculum on practice location of the current rural pharmacist workforce. There is limited evidence of students having an improved intention to practice rurally following a rural clinical placement. However, there is not enough evidence indicating whether students who have undertaken a supported placement through a UDRH have a greater interest in future rural practice compared to those who have undertaken a rural placement not associated with a UDRH. Additionally, a greater understanding of rural curriculum and rural clinical placements from both a student and university perspective will provide supporting information to guide recommendations for future strategies to address the rural pharmacy workforce maldistribution. Thank you.